Final short video is dealing with three other theories that are used in corporate governance, probably the other three most used theories of corporate governance. So while we've looked at agency theory, which is really focused on controlling the misalignment of interests between managers and shareholders that could occur under that relationship, these next three look at the role of the board and what corporate governance is doing in a slightly different way. Let's have a look first at a response to agency theory by Donaldson and Davis. Lex Donaldson is actually an Australian scholar from AGSM, and it's called stewardship theory. Stewardship theory, as I mentioned, was a bit of a reaction to agency theory because it came along and said, hey, you know what, this idea that managers are always going to try and rip off shareholders is probably not accurate. You know, often managers are going to act well, they're going to act in a good way, they're going to act as good stewards. Okay. And originally the theory was proposing that. So in psychology, one of the ways that they talk about people's motivation, McGregor talked about this idea of theory X and theory Y. Theory X assumes, you know, people are always self-serving and need to be controlled, whereas theory Y said, you know, essentially people are trustworthy and can be trusted. And so what we end up with is there's different ways of looking at people and their underlying motivation. Whereas agency theory is really focused on this theory X, stewardship originally was focused on theory Y. But then they started to think about it a bit more and said, well, you know what, sometimes managers do act as agents, that's true. And so in their later thinking, they came up with this idea of a contingency model. And they said, look, it's not so much how management's going to act. It's whether the system in place of governance matches how management's acting. So for instance, if management are going to act as agents, right, and the board treats them as agents, then the governance will work effectively. Similarly, if management is going to act as stewards and the board treats them as stewards, everything will work. However, the real problem can occur when there's this misalignment. So if management act as agents and the board treats them as stewards, we have a misalignment. And this could be a position where management could take advantage of this and incur high agency costs. Not so intuitive. If management act as stewards, but the board treat them as agents, well, in that case, what we might get is mistrust, a decrease in the relationship between the parties, and overall, again, a reduction in effectiveness. And so stewardship has come to be about this alignment between governance and the way that management act. And we know that that might even vary issue by issue. It's about being dynamic and just not monolithic in how we look at the motivations of management. A quite different theory from the previous two is one that comes from law called team production theory. So on the left here, traditionally, when we think about a company, we would draw a diagram where people report to one another, shareholders to a board, to a CEO, to managers, and really that invokes the principal-agent relationship. Team production theory actually has a different party at the top, you'll know. It has the board of directors. And what it says is, look, a company is really just a nexus of contracts or a whole form of contracts between lenders, suppliers, employees, managers, shareholders, and they all come together and have a contract which is this company to produce something. They sell that or deliver that service or that good into the market. Okay, now prior to the firm actually operating, no one knows whether they're going to make a true profit, a true economic profit, so as a rent, okay, in economics terms, an above normal profit. So these contracts at one level will be governed by the market. So there is a market for how much you pay employees, how much you'll pay suppliers, banks, etc. However, if we're successful, we will be paying that market price and we will have this leftover economic rent. And the role of the board is to distribute this surplus economic rent to the parties, to the factors of production that are most necessary for our success. So if your employees are really valuable, you might pay above award rates for those employees, or suppliers, or maybe a relationship with your bank is critical, or maybe it is equity and we've got to give surplus to our shareholders. So it's all about the board being the ultimate decision-making body. The term used is it's a mediating hierarchy. At the end of the day, someone has to make a decision about who gets this rent. Contracting is so uncertain prior to the firm forming that we don't know how to treat this in a contracting sense. So what we have is this body who distributes that economic rent, and they know the relative contributions of the parties and therefore apportion it correctly to get our best outcome. So what we can see is something quite distinct. You can also see that it does have a legal flavour to it because it's about contracts, and it also recognises the idea that the board of directors has the power of and control, and that is the way most organisations work. We do note, however, that there is substantial control and that the shareholders can appoint the directors, but it's the actual directors who issue the orders, who make, for instance, dividend payments, etc. Okay, so that's team production theory, our third theory, Blair and Stout. Our final theory is resource dependence theory. It's a little bit simpler, and all it says is rather than looking at internal control, one of the roles of the board is to provide access to resources. Another term that could be used is to ameliorate the environment or buffer the firm, right, from the external environment. It's a co-optation mechanism. So we have people on the board who can provide the firm capital, information, power, links to customers or suppliers, something that management can't bring. So it's often about the networks that directors bring. Okay. So that's another different way of looking at what is the role of a board. It's to link and buffer the firm over the long term, link it into that external environment with the directors acting as boundary spanners. So I know that that's been, quite a quick introduction to those theories, but we'll come back to those and hopefully you can see how those theories, particularly agency theory, but also the other theories for different aspects of governance, come into play in how we think about boards and what they need to do if we're going to have an effective governance system.